sinking in vain. Even my speaking isn't in vain. Is my playing the organ in vain? Is my praying in vain? Is my labor in vain? Is my singing in vain? Singing in vain. I know I'm speaking in vain. Is my playing and knocking in vain at Baby Temple, at the cathedral, at all these churches? Is my praying in vain? Is it in vain? Is it in vain? Is it in vain? Is it in vain? No, it ain't in vain. No. It's not all in vain. It's not all in vain. It's not all in vain. No, no. It's not all in vain. No, no. It's not all in vain. Here's why it's not in vain. Up the road. Well, they build their houses in preparation for the king, and they line the sidewalks with every sort of shiny thing. They will be surprised when they hear him say, take me to the alley, take me to the afflicted ones, take me to the lonely ones that somehow lost their way. Let them hear me say, I am your friend. Come to my table, rest here in you will have fun. Take me to the eye. Take me to the afflicted ones. Take me to the lonely ones that somehow lost their way.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming to our first Sankofa conversation as we celebrate 10 years in ministry as Woman Preach. We decided that we wanted to have a conversation with the people who were, the women, who were our first collaborators in our first two-day program. We did have Jarena Lee before the two-day program, but this was the first time that we reached out and decided to go beyond that first program. And I was in Memphis at the time, and Reverend Dr. Gina M. Stewart was and still is the pastor of Christ Missionary Baptist Church. And we were trying to figure out where we were going to have this two-day program. And I asked her, and before I could get the ask out, she had said yes, and had put her assistant, call Geraldine. It was Geraldine at the time. And Geraldine will handle it, right? So literally before I could get the ask out. And then I thought, who do we want to be our, at the time we were calling them wisdom elder. And Dr. Renita Weems said, I ain't nobody's elder. It was 10 years ago. She wouldn't say that today. So she said, you're going to have to come up with something other than elder. I was like, oh, okay. So I am the middle child between the three of us. And so these are my friends. Dr. Renita Weems has been my friend much longer than Dr. Stewart has been my friend. But when I moved to Memphis, a mutual friend of all three of ours said to me, here's the person you need to call as soon as you get to Memphis, and made the introduction, and we've been friends since. So those friendships gave birth to the collaboration that we had in October 2010. Now, what's so funny about that for me, Dr. Weems, is you couldn't make it to Memphis. Something happened in Nashville and you couldn't drive across. And we ended up having to bring you into the meeting on Skype.
That's correct, Skype.
And here we are again online. Those were harbingers of things to come, apparently.
Harbinger.
Yes. So the first thing I just want to say is thank you both for the way that you have walked for 10 years alongside Woman Preach. You have both been counsel to me. I'm gonna tell a couple of stories, and then we're gonna get started. Counsel to me, and you have been supporters of the ministry. So one of my favorite stories coming from Dr. Weems is this. Gina, you will appreciate this story. Sharice Tucker, who was our first executive director, and I were sitting in my house. It was in my house in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we were working on something, and the program wasn't coming together the way we wanted it to come together. So we called Dr. Weems and we told her we had been fasting and praying and blah, blah, blah. And she said, girl, go get a hamburger. You put in the time on fasting. Go with whoever comes and do this. Like 5,000 people came. And that piece of wisdom literally has carried us over these years, because there have been times when we actually did have to cancel a couple of programs, not oftentimes because of people, but because of other things that went wrong. But that, do it for five like you would do it for 5,000, has been a part of our own kind of ethos, right? My story about Gina is this. So Gina knew she wanted to give to Woman Preach. And those of you who may not know, she makes this crazy trail mix. And so she said to me, you better pray this trail mix sales, because that's how I'm giving the Woman Preach. So I went back to fasting and praying.
That's right.
So trail mix could sell.
Mix sales, girl. It's sales.
It's sales, honey. It's sales. It's sales. She's got a side gig now. She got a side gig.
Multiple streams of income.
So that's how I want to introduce our relationships to one another. Woman Preach prides itself, and I do mean pride itself, on being the kind of organization that does nothing without collaboration, and that is committed to both womanist/Black feminist sensibilities, so that when we approach text, when we bring people into what we call Woman Preach Nation, we are doing our best to the phrase that we use is bring women into full voice, or bring preachers into full voice, helping people find out what God sounds like in their own throat. So I want to start there. So Gina and or Renita, whichever one of you want to start this, how did you begin to find your own preaching voice?
Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, Gina.
Okay. I would say well, first of all, let me backtrack and say I started speaking before I started preaching. I was what they call a bootleg preacher in the Baptist church. And I did that for about 10 years before I actually acknowledged the call to preach. And so I, for the most part, prior to that, had not gone to seminary. So much of what I knew about preaching was more caught than taught. There were women in my tradition who were exhorters. They were not allowed to call themselves preachers, but in a very real sense, they were preachers. And because I used to narrate and for a community choir, and I just loved to go to church. I would go to church in the morning, and then in the evening, we would go, myself and my pastor's daughter and I, Carla, she's Carla Eubanks now, we would go to different churches, and we would see these different people, and particularly these women voices. I heard these different women voices who were not preachers, but who were speakers, but were definitely preachers in their own right. So much of my finding my voice is a combination of hearing others preach, those whose voices I admired. Practice, of course, you learn to preach when you're given opportunity, and I was fortunate in that my pastor gave me opportunity to preach shortly after I started speaking and preaching. And I think you just kind of evolve. You grow in your preaching as you listen to yourself, and you read and go back and listen to yourself again, and you read and go back and listen to yourself. And I've just always attempted to be authentically who I am. While I admire Dr. Renita Weems as a scholar and a preacher, I know that I'm not Dr. Renita Weems. I admire Dr. Claudette Copeland and many others as preachers, but I know I'm not them. And so what I do try to do, though, is I look at what they do well, and I try to incorporate some of that into my own preaching ministry, not necessarily do it exactly like them, but those techniques, the skills that they bring to the preaching moment, their insight to the text, etc. Those are things that I think about and attempt to incorporate when I'm preaching. But the way I found my voice was learning to be comfortable in my own skin and be who I am.
Come back to that, learning to be comfortable in your own skin. Dr. Weems?
Yeah. Well, voice means a lot of things. And I'm sitting here trying to trying to say to myself, what does voice? And I've taught a class once on for women preachers, and I'm trying to recall that PowerPoint where I talked about voice, and it certainly has to do with authority. It certainly has to do with being authentic. It certainly has to do with being your honest self. And it has to do with being audible. I'm trying to work with those A's. But nevertheless, it's all of those kinds of things. So where do you find that? I mean, I think that's what we're talking about. And like Gina, and I appreciate that we are on a first name basis here, that all that Reverend Doctor stuff is going to drive us crazy trying to get to the question after we do all of that stuff. So like Gina, I was a Sunday school teacher. I was a women's Bible study teacher. I was, so, and I came to ministry from being a public accountant and a stockbroker. So standing before the public, thinking on my foot, learning how to think on my feet, and learning how to teach people. So I came into ministry with some of that background first and foremost. And certainly, as I've already told the story of wanting to be a writer, but I also had the good fortune, and I would say that the good fortune of sitting up under some very powerful women as I was growing up. I can start with Mother Noble, Lottie Noble, there in Atlanta, who was not a preacher in the Church of God in Christ, but she was a mother of the church. And I was telling someone the other day, when Mother Noble lifted a song during devotion, God is a good God, yes, He is, and there was always an entree into her ultimately doing an exhortation. Okay. An exhortation, so she got the mic because she could sing God is a good God. I'm a soldier in the army of the Lord. And then she would take it from there. That image, and then going away to college, and very honestly and openly going to St. Paul AME Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and meeting Cecilia Bryant changed my life. A different model of a pastor's wife, a different model of a woman who was not in ministry, but was on the cutting edge of women's ministry work. All of those kinds of things contributed to my ability, I think, to be patient with myself in finding my own voice. Mm-hmm. There is a certain degree of mimicry that goes on in the beginning. There's no doubt about that. I'm also I'm a quilter, and I sew, and there's a certain amount of mimicking that I do when I sew. I need a template before I can just strike out and create my own quilts. I need somebody to tell me what blocks and where those things go, and you do that. That's what artists do. You follow a template. So I did all of those kinds of things, and eventually, hopefully, with, as Gina said, with practice, with the right community of people. Okay, we can talk. I'd like to just put a pin on that later on. With surrounding yourself with a good community of people who give you honest feedback, and people who give you resources, and people you trust. You can do it. You can find your own voice. So I think those are some of the components. If we can just at least tease out a few, and I'm sure throughout this conversation we'll have time to come back to those.
Sure. I started preaching when I was, I accepted my call when I was 18, but I probably started preaching when I was 15. So again, in the Church of God, Anderson, so Holiness Church. But I grew up also in the Baptist church where I had a Sunday school teacher, Miss Perline, who was so subversive. She would read things to us and she'd say, "Do you believe that?" Like, so it was literally in this small southern, in the woods, Alabama church where I learned that you could actually ask questions of the text. And I never felt constrained around that. That and the fact that my mother was also a teacher and she would ask all these questions. She was the first person reading something that wasn't the King James version of the Bible that freaked me out when I was younger, because, but she had the Living Bible. Remember that little Bible that they used to do? And it was in the bathroom, and I would go in there and read it and I'm sure she left that in that bathroom on purpose now. Like I didn't know that when I was younger, but she was like, I know you don't understand all those D's and thous, but here. So yeah, I do want you to say more, both of you, to say more about community around you, because I do think that one of the things that Woman Preach Nation has provided people over these 10 years is community. I know there are people who have met people in workshops that they're still in relationship with. They get stuck on sermons, they call each other. I don't know that I could preach if I didn't have that kind of community. If I couldn't call somebody and say, girl, ain't no good news, help me. You know, because there's sometimes when you're working through a text and you're like, and it would be easy just to give up on the text than to go into community and think that through. So either one of you that want to say something more about the community you surround yourself with to become better in your craft, in your art.
I think there's some years ago, you know, we've talked about in some of these Zoom conversations about this whole notion of women being competitive with one another, being petty with one another. And that's a part of a stereotype, a kind of script that's out there that I have always completely rejected and have, in fact, been outraged when people even would dare to bring that up in my presence, because I just think that is a stereotype. So a toxic stereotype that we perpetuate. But I'm
gonna quote you from I Asked from Intimacy. That's a lie that's a vanity from the mind of some man.
That's a vanity from the mind of some man to keep women at odds with each other. Keep women at odds. But I have always had women friends and friends that I have known for years, and friends who have, as one bishop in the AME church says, we pace each other to excellence.
Right.
So it is not so much we tear each other down, but we have, whether in more implicit than explicitly, I don't even know if we have talked about it, but I would say that we have paced each other to excellence. And have we looked at each other and said, now see, if I could just do what she does when she does that right there. Sure, we have said that. Now we've said, if I could sing like Claudette, I would never preach. I preach because I can't sing like Claudette. But if I could sing like Claudette, and if I could close a sermon like Gina Stewart and spend 22 minutes on the close, I could be a woman. Can't nobody close a sermon like Gina Stewart. She's gonna take a whole nother 22 minutes. If I can just close. Okay, so we all, you know, whatever. So we all have things that we have looked at and said, if I could just, and these have been friends, and people have not understood how you can be, all of you, preaching machines, as people want to claim, and then also be friends. Because we place preaching as one aspect of our lives. That's not the whole total aspect of our lives. Mm-hmm. And we have been very generous with one another in terms of sharing information and sharing engagements and sharing tales of our greatest humiliation. People always want to talk about our great achievement, but girl, we call each other and say, girl, let me tell you what I just got my girl. If I could, I can't tell nobody the fool I just made of myself in that pulpit. Girl, I didn't have no ending. I ain't have no beginning. And then the pastor was a fool. That's the stuff that nobody tells you about. So all they see is that we are preaching machines. It's like you've got a circle of women who you can say, girl, let me tell you what happened. And so I think that kind of support is also what we're talking about in terms of a community we are still, the church is still comfortably patriarchal.
Yeah, comfortably.
It is still comfortably in the hands of men. Yeah. We are still, in terms of our presence in the pulpit and religious and leadership, period. And preaching is not, being a woman in ministry is not just about preaching, but in terms of, we are still in the minority. Mm-hmm. And so I think that all of these great images that we see of Black women in the pulpit or women in the pulpit, don't get it mistaken. Patriarchy is still going strong. And so therefore, we are still in need of our communities, our conversations, and our friendships and relationships, even with men who are our allies as well. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah. Yeah, Gina.
Okay, so I would say that I had layers of communities because initially, of course, I didn't grow up seeing any women preachers. And so my initial community was my church community. There were a group of women who just believed in what God had placed in my life and placed on my life, who would often go with me when I would go to preach in different places. And even when I flunk came and met me and escorted me down the aisle, you know, it was the best sermon that they had ever heard. So they were great. They were great for my self-esteem and my own sense of self-worth because they just believed in what they saw in me. And, you know, of course, now in retrospect, I understand why that meant so much to them, because I guess in some ways I was the substance of what they possibly had hoped for.
Right.
And so they were very encouraging. You know, my mother, my grandmother, my grandparents, you know, no matter what I preached about, they would cry. And, you know, they thought it was the best thing they'd ever heard. Even my daddy was very, very supportive. In fact, my daddy was a business owner. He owned a service station for many years. But and he wouldn't even go to church on Sundays because he was working 7 days a week. But when I started preaching, that joker started putting on a suit coming to church because his daughter was preaching. You know, he was really proud. So I would say initially it was my faith community, my church, and then of course seminary helped me to some degree, although that setting was often antagonistic in preaching classes because Blacks would be pitted against whites in preaching classes. And, you know, there was not necessarily constructive feedback. Oftentimes it was very antagonistic, but it was helpful nevertheless. And then I met a friend who also became a mentor, who really, really became that community of one to some degree, because we would often talk about preaching. You couldn't talk to, and Renita knows this, a Reverend Shirley Prince without talking about preaching. Right. She had an amazing mind, was an amazing preacher, amazing person. And so I had many opportunities to share with her up close and personal. We'd go to lunch or go to dinner and we'd talk for hours, not just about preaching, but talk about ministry. And she would give me instruction. And she would often give me say the hard things to me that needed to be said. Those things that really, at the moment, I did not necessarily appreciate, but I'm better for it now because of it. And then, of course, as time progressed, I began to meet new people and meet other people, as Renita has already said, friends that are also preachers that became conversation partners. Dr. Carolyn Knight, for example, is one of the persons that I often talk to about sermons. And then, of course, as she just said, we talk to each other and we share our tales, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all the stuff that nobody would ever believe ever happened to us. We call and tell each other, girl, I just died a slow but tragic death. And in the words of Claudette, I want to get into bed in a fetal position and put a cover over my head. So,
no, to quote Claudette, I want to twirl my hair and
right. Being and then, you know, girl, it's 2:00 and I still ain't got nothing.
Yes.
You know, so it's having that kind of reinforcement and goodwill from other sisters who preach that really has been a tremendous blessing. And that you learn from as well.
That you learn from. I think one of the things that Woman Preach has done, when I said we create this kind of, Renita, when you came to do my installation and we took the Woman Preach Nation picture, there were all these people there, and I was like, I didn't even know they were, of course I didn't see them until we got ready to take the picture, but what it reminded me of is this forming community. People who will both hold you accountable, tell you that your dress is hiked up in your pantyhose. Not that everybody's wearing pantyhose anymore, but proverbial.
I still wear pantyhose.
Okay. In your teeth, but you get my point. You know that if you're the kind of person that can't
She's from Memphis.
Can't take criticism, then you won't ever grow in your preaching.
Yeah.
Help her.
Yeah. I mean, these are the beautiful stories of ministry. You know, sure you got a lot of people on who want to hear about the 4 steps to a great sermon and the 9 steps to, you know, how to interpret a text, and the 11 steps to how you get into the mega churches to preach and all that kind of stuff. The truth of the matter is, you know, it is in the fullness of time. That's all you can say. It's in the fullness of time. Your doors will open. Your opportunities will come. You will be prepared. You will do what needs to be done. But in the meantime, we're saying, get some friends, get a community, and that you are only, I tell students all the time, you're only as good as your dialogue partners. That's the truth of it. You're only as good as, and only as good as the books that you're reading and your dialogue partners.
Right.
And if you're not, and anybody can preach, but not everybody has longevity.
Right.
So, you know, we've got, you know, everybody got a sermon somewhere. Everybody got a little word somewhere. But you're talking to 2 women here who have had also longevity. And that's a whole nother kind of, that, not totally, but there's something else going on when you got a body of work, and you got some degree of longevity. That's about persistence. That is about a whole lot of other things that I think
one of the things that makes me think of, Renita, is our very first gathering in October 2010. I can still hear you. Someone asked you, what will help your preaching? And you said this, I'm going to quote you back to you. You said, for the most part, women preachers can be boring because they won't read nothing but the Bible. And so you said,
ooh, did I say that?
Yeah, you so said it, and now it's on video one more time.
Okay, yeah.
But when you said it, what you then said was, if you don't know the world, if you don't have hobbies, if you don't travel, if you don't read novels, how will you understand the human condition? So I wanted to know if you want to say more about that now that I have quoted you back to yourself, since you don't actually remember saying that, but it stuck with me.
It sounds like Renita Wing.
It's
It's
definitely you.
Well, you know, I say again, you know, I wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to write a novel. I started off in New York after I left my job with Merrill Lynch. I wanted to write a 19th century abolitionist novel that looked at abolitionist movement and the suffragette movement. And I wanted a Black character who was torn between those 2 movements, probably because that I have been torn between, you know, Black theology and feminist and womanist theology, perhaps, you know, all of that. So writing and being a novelist and the world of creating an art and have always been a part of me. So I'm saying all that to say that I think that most people think you just open the Bible and just start, thus says the Lord. God speak to me. You know, and when I was a child, I spoke and thought like a child and preached like a child and hermeneutic like a child. But after a while, in order to get to the pathos of this text, in order to paint a picture, I mean, my greatest role model, somebody I never met. Now, those who want to meet their great role model, let me say who to me was the preacher for a while that I wanted. Now, see, I wanted to write like Toni Morrison. I wanted to preach like Gardner Taylor.
Yes, Lord.
Okay, let me say that again. I wanted to write like Toni Morrison, but I wanted to preach like Gardner Taylor. And you cannot listen to Gardner, the late Reverend Dr. Gardner Taylor preach and not get that this man read.
Right.
You cannot paint the photo. You cannot paint the picture of the stars and the skies and the moon and all that unless you have read some of the poetry that he was reading back then. And so I wanted that kind of mind that could call on a number of books that I have read and synthesize them and bring them to bear in helping me make the biblical text come alive. That's what I wanted. I wanted what movies and books and other conversations and other kinds of hobbies taught me so that I could bring those to bear to make scripture come alive.
Right.
And the great directors of Ava DuVernay, others who you often call the name, these are well-read people. You don't just sit down and start writing a script. You have read broadly.
Right.
and then come to the writing of a movie. Likewise, you have read broadly, and then you understand Hagar, and then you understand the woman at the well, and then you understand David and Jonathan's relationship.
It makes me think, I mean, that is at the level of preparation. And so one of the things, Gina, I've heard you say over the years many times, the call to preach is the call to prepare.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
And so that's a kind of preparation that most people don't consider. But I also think what you have often said is that's what took you to seminary, Gina.
Right.
And so many times people will say back to me, "Oh, are you trying to say I gotta be a doctor so and so?" What I'm like, no,
Mhm.
I'm not saying that, but you do need to learn something.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
you need
Correct.
wherever you're getting that, and you need to learn how to critically think about what you're reading.
Right.
You know, so a lot of times people, I'm not going to try to malign anything here. We'll just pick up something and that's what they know because it came out of what they know, but they don't know how to put it in conversation with people who think radically different from them.
Right.
Go
Right.
ahead, Gina, if you want to.
Yeah. I to me, seminary was just the next logical step. Nobody told me to do it. I just figured that if I was going to take this craft seriously, I needed to be trained. I needed more than what I had received in my own context, in terms of scholarship and scripture and preaching. And so I made the decision. I said, well, if doctors go to medical school and dentists go to dental schools,
Yeah.
then,
Where
and
preachers go.
we're dealing with folks' soul. This is eternal. I need to go to school, and had no aspirations at all for pastoring, anything like that. I was working in higher ed. I thought I was going to heaven from Shelby State Community College. I was a director of admissions for a community college and didn't know I would pastor or anything like that. But I knew I needed some more tools, and I knew that I needed something beyond what I had already
Absolutely.
received in terms of Sunday school and what I was receiving from my pastor. Because even though my pastor was very affirming and an educated man, he was not seminary trained. And of course, I had people around me, Shirley Prince again, who encouraged me to go back to seminary. So it wasn't just myself. I made the decision, but she affirmed it and encouraged me to pursue
Absolutely.
it. And I'm glad
Absolutely.
I did.
Absolutely.
Because the critique, the critical skills that are necessary, the deconstruction that happens when you go through seminary, all of that I learned in seminary. And so it just kind of helped to broaden my preaching palette, if you will. For what I was getting ready to do, not knowing that I would be pastoring. But I'm so glad I did, because by the time I finished seminary, I was called to my church. It was a seamless transition. I graduated I actually finished my last course in December of 95, and I was elected in March of 95. So I didn't have the burden of trying to go to school and trying to pastor at the same time. And I'm grateful that I did that.
Let me say that I did not. I mean, I went to. I came into ministry, and I certainly. I mean, it would be. It would be not true if I said that I was not thinking of being a preacher. But I ultimately went to the PhD route, and I may have taken one or two required homiletics courses because, if you're going to get the MDiv as opposed to the MTS or whatever it was back then, you took some preaching courses. So I took the preaching courses. I don't know how seriously. I mean, I was probably resistant and talking in the way Gina talked about having taken preaching classes. And this was Presbyterian church, school and all of that, And this is the 80s and Presbyterian school. So I took the required homiletics classes. I'm not sure if I learned anything or if I took anything away from that, but I did study preaching by observing people, and whether that's from Caesar Clark, Gina, to,
right.
And a certain man had two sons. Yeah.
Right.
So whether it was Caesar Clark, whether it was Arlene Chern, whether it was, Gardner Taylor, whether it was Wyatt T. Walker, whether it was Jasper Williams, whether it was Whalum, Kenneth Whalum, you know,
Yep.
all of these kinds of people. I studied them. I wanted to, once I became a professor, I know that, and became a scholar, that changed for me my appetite for preaching and what I was willing to do as a preacher. That kind of equipment that I came away with as a scholar would forever change my whole understanding of preaching. And so scholarship, academic scholarship, biblical scholarship stole something. It took something away, in you know, in all honesty, it took away my naivete, my earnest desire for preaching. It became a critic on my shoulder and made me question preaching and question what I was doing. I was no longer comfortable as a preacher. I preached, but I was no longer comfortable with just following the text. I was no longer comfortable with, as someone once said to me, a dear friend of mine who was my mentor at the time, and you know, this is when our relationship was was about to end anyway. You know, when the protege is no longer protegeic, and so she said to me, she says, you know, the difference between you and me, Renita, she says, I preach my answers and you preach your questions.
You know, Frank Thomas said that to me.
Yes, and I had begun to preach
I'm a biblical
questions.
scholar.
Yes, and I had begun to preach questions, and I was embarrassed. I mean, I was kind of like, dang, you're right. I mean, I come from a Pentecostal church. I know you're supposed to have answers. Anybody, you ain't supposed to be getting up there with a bunch of questions. You ain't supposed to be up there challenging people's belief. Ain't got we oppress people. We ain't got time for questions. Oppressed people need answers. And so I felt convicted now. Mind you, that broke my heart. It broke my heart. You preach your questions and I preach my answers, and I preach answers, you know. And I mean, and I mean, I was convicted. I felt shame, embarrassed, but but the questions were who I am. And so I just say to you, I mean, I've gotten more comfortable, but that's why I can't close no sermon. See, that's why I can't, because I can't, that's why I still can't close, because you doggone got questions. You got to have answers to close the way Gina closed it.
Well, this is actually a good segue, because part of what we're constantly doing at Woman Preach, and this is a Pray Through Your Hall thing that we got, which is interrogating the text. So Dale Andrews, may he rest in peace.
May he rest in peace.
Was one of my mentors, and one of the things that he used to say all the time is, how does the most vulnerable person in the room hear what you're about to say? And you're talking about something that stuck the word in my throat. That was like, because you know, there are things you say that are just regular tropes. And then if that becomes the question, you're like, I guess I can't say that. I guess I can't. So this whole notion of interrogating the text, what you have called, Renita, preaching from the underside, or did the Beecher lectures at, Can we talk about that? Because I think that's a good segue into prophetic preaching, which I now want to spend some time on.
Yeah. Go ahead, Gina. Why don't you start there? Because
I do think of you both, I think of myself as prophetic preachers. And let me say this as well. Oftentimes people say, well, if you're a prophetic preacher, you still got to be pastoral, or you still got to be whatever the other category. But my thing is to be a prophetic preacher, that is to look over the shoulder of God and see things as they ought to be and not just as they are. It's also pastoral, because you're helping correct people's lenses. And if that's not pastoral, I don't know what is. Anyway, that's my little volley into that conversation about how do you take the questions as a part of this interrogating of the text in order to preach prophetically. And maybe we need to say what prophetic preaching is, so that's there too for y'all to.
Gina, I mean, really, and I'm not being, trying to be modest, because you are working on the PhD in homiletics in particular, I would really want to follow this over to you, and then I like to just kind of, you provoke me into maybe some answers that I might give. You're thinking about this in your dissertation.
Right, sure. One of the things that I would say has helped us was actually a class we took from Valerie. Not just in relation.
They told me they couldn't preach certain text ever.
Not just in relation to
God.
prophetic preaching, but this notion that you talked about, preaching from the underside,
Yeah.
and not necessarily following along with the narrator, but looking at where we know that when we preach, we're preaching from where we sit, but we're also not always identifying with the protagonist. You know, so often when we preach, we're the hero in the story. We're always the good guy. We're always the one that saves the day. But you helped us when we took that class on the Torah to begin to look at the text from the side of people who are often voiceless and marginalized. You know, we talked about the Exodus story after we read Musa Dubé, I think that was her book, and she talked about the Exodus story not as liberation, but as conquest, which is a whole different way of looking at that. But when you think about people that live that are victimized by colonization and things like that, it gives you a whole different lens for looking at the text. The other thing I would say is that for me as a pastor, I haven't always been one who leaned toward prophetic preaching. What sort of helped to sharpen my lens and make me more sensitive was becoming a part of the Proctor Conference.
Right.
And being challenged by going to those conferences and going to the various workshops and doing the kind of analysis that forces us to look at some of these realities and disparities that we see, and that makes us say something is wrong with this picture. But not only something wrong with this picture is out of alignment with God's intentions for the flourishing of humankind. And so I had to make some decisions, in the words of Dr. Mafiko at the ITC, of whether or not I wanted to continue to be a masseuse or whether I wanted to begin to take the risk of preaching prophetically, because there is a risk of preaching prophetically in this season, in this time of, as Frank Thomas would say, get my breakthrough and get my praise on. You know, it's much easier to default to that than it is to really, as Renita said, deal with some of these questions. How come a cop can be on the news with his knee in somebody's neck and it's
in broad daylight?
In broad daylight, and it's on film, and nothing happens. And surely God has something to say about that. And so it takes kind of some homiletical courage, I think, as a pastor, to decide that you're going to address those kinds of issues, because in general, many people are not necessarily thinking about those things. They're thinking about those immediate concerns that affect their lives, and that's true. And so, of course, you know, I may not always be, there's going to always be a slither of something prophetic or something related to social justice in my sermons. But I recognize that we have to also address some of those existential realities that faith answers as well.
Right.
But to address how the things that are going on this present age is out of alignment with God's intentions for human flourishing, I think is to do a disservice if we don't. We don't have the luxury of being silent.
Right.
Yeah. We are those of us who are on this line, and those I see some of the names of the people in the chat room. And we are, and myself included, I'm a part of a generation who came through seminary and graduate school in an era of what we realize now, what we may look back and call the period of deconstructionism. So when we talk about, you know, the underside and looking on the, you know, not seeing the text just from the protagonist, this is not something that we created. We are students of seminary. We are educated clergy who have sat under certain methodologies. You go to certain kinds of schools, you get exposed to. I don't know what it means to go to Liberty University for seminary. I don't know what it means to go to Dallas Seminary for seminary. I don't know what it is to go to maybe Gordon Conwell. And I'm not throwing any shade necessarily right now. Not at this second. I'm not throwing any shade on any of those schools. I got opinions about them, but where the mainline schools that I have attended, I'm associated with many of us who are part of this whole larger conversation, your panel. We've gone to the kind of liberal mainline schools where you are introduced to, methodologies. You are introduced to scientific, the academic study of religion and the academic study of biblical texts. Let's get there. And there are certain methodologies that we are introduced to we broadly call them historical criticism, but by the time I was certainly a professor, we moved into critical theory, we moved into deconstructionism, we moved into audience criticism, we moved into ideological criticism, and all of those things have impacted the way the questions that we come to the text with. So I want to first just kind of lay out and say, this is not just something that we just sort of this is not a cottage work that we have just kind of created for ourselves. We are trained clergy, and these are tools that we have gained along the way, even if we didn't know what Renita Weems just mentioned on all of these things. This is what's happening, and we are text centered. We are Protestant women. We are Protestant Christians, and so we believe there's something about the centrality of the text. And we have been raised to believe that the centrality, that the text, the meaning of the text is tied to whatever the writer tells us is the meaning of the text, and the protagonist, that we go along with the protagonist, we go along with the flow of the story, and we identify with the Egyptians when we're supposed to, and we identify with the Israelite, etc. And all of that, those kinds of things. And I just kind of dropped a whole lot of stuff right there in that kind of comment and those kind of comments. But as it relates to being prophetic, and so therefore, the question is, and so therefore, that's why I love these Zoom conversations, because you're just kind of packaging a whole lot of stuff in a few little seconds. So for me, in terms of what we mean when we say prophetic ministry, let's be clear, those of us who are clergy women who are trying to do some prophetic work, I'm not what's the language now? A thought leader.
Oh, yeah.
A social critic, a public intellectual. Okay, everybody wants to be a thought leader, a social critic. I'm just not somebody we're not just people who just read the newspaper. Nobody reads the newspaper. Read their news feed and then had a hunch about what God was doing. See, that's not what we're doing. We're not talking about. Prophetic preaching is about not just being socially astute, not just being, I read my paper, and so therefore I want to have a comment, and I got a bullet platform, and I think I'll say something. That prophetic preaching why it ought to be a part of all of our preaching is that, to me, prophetic preaching is about exposing structures.
Yes.
It is not just about. It is about calling the name of Sandra Blind. It is about calling the name of Breonna Taylor. It is about that. But it is something that I wrote years ago in an Ebony magazine when I talked about the history of the Black church. The word of faith preacher, the conservative preacher, and I know this is generalization, talks about we are poor. The prophetic preacher talks about why are we poor.
That's right. That's right.
It is one thing to say you got the spirit of poverty on you, and God wants you to have money, and God wants you to be rich. And I've said all of that. I can say all of that. That is fine. And there are things that you need to do to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and with the help of the Holy Ghost, you can do it. Blah, blah, blah. That's one thing. It's another thing to be able to help people see. Let me tell you something. There are some structures that are designed to keep you poor.
Right.
There are some people, there are some spiritual wickedness in high places that are designed to keep you. That is what makes it prophetic. It is exposing that the people, there's a amount that the people have to do, but the people got to understand, don't be crushed when you don't get that blessing. It is not always because God doesn't intend, it is because some racists out there, employers are out there, and we got to speak to that. That to me is what makes prophetic preachers, is that they're also able to step back and say, there is an element, can these bones live? And I'm just using this because I just preached this on Sunday. Can these bones live?
Yes.
All right, okay, but look at him. There are some Babylonians back up in here who are invested in these bones never living. We're going to preach the Holy Ghost and bring them bones together. But just know the Babylonians sitting up there saying, yeah, right.
and they armed.
It'll never happen.
It'll never happen.
Yeah, it'll never happen.
So let
And
me
can
help
I
you
just say,
get closing,
can I
Dr.
just say
Lynn.
too, Valerie, that, you know,
Yes,
and to
please.
piggyback on what Renita has said, is also, you know, engaging critically with the world and the church, and engaging critically with ourselves.
Yes.
Critical engagement, yeah.
So what I was getting ready to say to help you, Renita, with your closing here is, yes, once you have exposed, I always, now that I've seen all the series of the movie, The Matrix, now it's violent, but there's a point here, which is once you see, you can never unsee.
That's right.
Right. So the prophetic, the exposure is the, I can't remember who told this story. Oh, it was Jeremiah Wright Jr., the drunk man who goes to church, hears this sermon, then walks outside with his bottle in his hand as the saints are coming out the door saying, "Now what you gonna do about it?" Right? so
that's right. That's right.
So part of it is who are we gonna be and what are we gonna do? Now that we have exposed this in the movie series of The Matrix, they decide to form a community to fight against the Matrix, you know the story and whatever. But there's always people like the guy who wants to take the pill to go back into the Matrix because it's too hard to fight against systems, you know. So we're back to this whole community. You can't fight a system by yourself.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, and so it's not just the community of people that helps your preaching, it's also the community of people that shore you up to help you be prophetic. Like, so Gina said Proctor. It's I have a whole community of activists, many of whom ain't thinking about church, ain't coming to church, don't like your church, but they keep me honest. Like, so I can't talk about the street if I ain't talking to the people in the street, taking the bullets, taking the, you know, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
So some of that also is a part of sort of shaping and putting in place our prophetic voice.
Yes.
I want to ask you both before I look at the Q&As, because we only have 30 more minutes, and Gina may have to leave us a little bit early, so I want to honor that. Sunday cometh.
Every Sunday.
7 days.
Real quick.
Yeah. And it comes quickly. Like today, like this Sunday feels like it's coming too quick because of all the things that's been happening as well. So I am wondering if we can help those preachers who have to preach Sunday think about Pentecost in the face of Black death, state-sanctioned vigilante Black death that keeps coming like lynchings. I mean, it's almost like these videos served like lynchings did in the past. Like the videos are traumatizing, just like the body hanging from the tree was traumatizing. But Pentecost is coming, and people got to preach Sunday. And how do they preach Pentecost without and not ignore the realities we're facing?
Well, I think that these are the kinds of things that says to us, for those of us who, I do not preach every Sunday, but I preach more than I want to. So, and I have been preaching long enough to know how important resources are. So I will say that the first thing that comes to my mind is how, as both a professor, as an academic, a scholar, as a researcher, as a writer, as a preacher, I do a lot of going online to look for stuff. There is so much trash on religious websites. There is, woe be, yes, if I could say it in the most King Jamesiest language, woe be unto thee who click the first thing, who put in Ezekiel, and the first thing that comes up, you start reading it. Don't even read. You need to click about to the 7th page of Google before you even look at it, because the first seven pages of Google
junk.
Is, he's coming back again.com, and the Holy Ghost is with you.com. I mean, trash sites. But that group has dominated the religious internet, the religious virtual internet, whatever the language is. Those websites out there that we draw on for our information for our sermon, because we too lazy to do deeper research or go to googlescholar.com. And that trash that's out there is pablum. It is, it's saccharine. It is, I mean, and I read some of myself, when I just need a quick little thought of something. But my point is, to answer that question, Valerie, we really need, and I've been in conversation with people to talk about Black Christian education resources, and that's a whole nother thing. We need some lectionaries. We need our own websites. We need blackpreaching.com. We need socialjusticepreaching.com. We need sites that help us look at text differently. There are some good ones out there. There are a few that I have gone to, but by and large, we need some resources for many of us. And like, how do you, I think we did African American lectionary. Is that right?
African American pulpit.
The African American
pulpit and lectionary.
African American lectionary. You can still find it.
But that's a little bit defunct now. Am I correct?
Yeah, but you can still find it.
You can find some things there. So in terms of those kinds of things, so what books you ought to be reading, what stuff you ought to be reading, I wanted to at least put that out there. I mean, I don't know if I have some specific suggestions about the Pentecost. I think there's some obvious kinds of things, but I want to at least put out there the need for resources and our own websites to help us get at some of those social justice things. And I would be happy if some of the people who are in your conversation there on the comments, if they would include for all of us, what are some of their favorite websites to go to for good preaching resources on how to enter a text. And that even I am always looking for those. And maybe Gina, you have some suggestions as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really had not planned to preach this Sunday because this is a month of celebration, but I'm coming off of my celebration because I need to talk. I need to say something Sunday. Quite frankly, I have not decided just yet what that's going to look like or what it's going to be. I can't hardly talk, period, because of the trauma that, I've been seeing, but I know that there has to be, that God has a word. What that word is going to look like and what that word is going to be, I'm not exactly sure. I just know that this Sunday, rather than not preaching, I will. I would only add to what Renita has said that there are a number of Black scholars whose books we ought to have in our library. I think about Will Gaffney. I think about Renita's writings. I think about the work that you do, Valerie, in terms of African American liturgy, worship and liturgy. I think that those are resources that we all ought to have when we talk about looking at the text in different ways, rather than just through the conventional and traditional ways that we look at the text. And then, of course, I'm a student of culture and scripture, and I try to read for breadth and depth. So, not only do I read the Bible, but I read magazines, I read periodicals, and not all of them are necessarily spiritual or faith-based periodicals. I read business publications. I watch nighttime drama because, drama gives me plots because I don't use points, I do moves. So I get ideas from that, and they also pique my attention and give me questions and thoughts to wrestle with in terms of preaching. So I would only add to what Renita has said that, we definitely want to look at some of these Black scholars that are writing. Stony the Road We Trod is one resource, the African,
Classic.
Yeah, and I can't think of the other commentary. I'll have to look it up in my.
To Our Native Land and Africa.
True to Our Native Land, yeah, that's the one I was getting ready to.
And the womanist one with Mitzi and Gay Byron. Yeah,
right.
By all means, we ought to be aware of those. Thank you, Val. I know you're reaching for them. I know you're reaching for them, babe. Reach for them. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. But I didn't.
Exercising Evil by Cheryl Kirk Dugan. Absolutely, Dugan. That's right. Absolutely. Thank you, somebody, for putting those.
But my point here, your point here is, well, let me just say, my point here is that Sunday comes every Sunday. Every week. There's something that traumatizes marginalized communities. It just is true, period. And even if you're, and I often am, even if you're preaching to a predominantly white congregation, they need deliverance too. Who was
Right.
it? Was it Gardner C. Taylor that says, "Afflict the comfortable and comfort
Comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable.
wasn't that Taylor? Gardner C. Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't know how you get brave. So one of the things
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ella P. Mitchell used to say to me all the time, Ella Pearson Mitchell, may she rest in peace, used to say to me all the time, "Oh, Valerie, you're so brave." And other people would have called it foolishness, right? You know, my insistence that you, even if you figure out how to say it differently, because sometimes you have to translate depending on the situation you're in, you still got to say what is true in that moment. Yeah, let me say, I am not preaching for Pentecost, but I am writing a piece that has to be in by midnight tonight. Yes, and I have been, it's only 500 words, and I've been working on it for 2 days, and I kind of have this concept that has just struck me, that what the Spirit did for them is gave them the power to come out of hiding, and that the people that were countered by the Spirit were from all over. And so in some ways, the Spirit flattened the curve, if you will. The hierarchies were wiped out because of the Spirit in that moment. Now, the church has managed to rebuild those hierarchies, but that wasn't, I mean, the Spirit blowing on all of them and lighting upon each of them helped literally flatten this hierarchical curve and gave them courage to come out of hiding, which is what I'm saying in this writing. So that's kind of my way of getting at, how do you face the world that is unsafe, right? Because that's what the Spirit does. They were hiding for a reason. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, of course. Now that's, you know, I don't know if I'm enough Pentecostal to say, and Baptist, and then Methodist to say, you know, you don't have to go to Acts at all. You know, it's Pentecost Sunday, but there are other. If you want to focus on the Holy Spirit and the sin of the Holy Spirit, the power of the Spirit of God, you know, I'm not much of a lectionary preacher, but every now and then but I do understand the Ascension Sunday. You know, I know Easter Sunday morning, you ought to be coming on out of, you know where you're going to be preaching from.
Out of a grave.
You're going to have to give up now.
You better come up out of a grave. We're going to take your papers.
If you don't get them out of the grave on Easter, you don't go to the book of Nehemiah on Easter Sunday morning.
All right, I'm going to turn now to the Q. Thank you both for this part of the conversation. So I'm going to look at, I got to put my glasses on so I don't look like so I can actually read this. So question is, we've heard how important community is among sister preachers. How important is it to have a male mentor in preaching?
I don't know how important it is. I don't think it's good. It is if you have, you know, it's nice if you have one. And many of us are women who have had great male allies, who have had male mentors, who have had male friends. I mean, so we are, you know, to talk about, you know, I don't know if that question would have been asked of men, you know, is it important to have? So yeah, of course, the church is patriarchal. Men run the church. Yes, we will have a male mentor. We will have a male prayer partner, a pastor, a bishop, or somebody. So it's a given. Not all of them are our enemies. There are certainly, I certainly have to say that there have been some very important men in my life, and I've called out men whose preaching I have admired. So obviously, I have been very much so shaped by the male voice, if you will, and the male point of view, if you will, because I live in the United States of America, because I live in the West, period. Right. So this is not just a church thing. This is also our culture. So and there are some men who are great allies. I would just say that. And there are some men who are great allies. And if you find one who will mentor you with integrity, you She who finds a male mentor who can mentor you with integrity has found a good thing.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I would say that my first mentor was male. It was my pastor.
Mm-hmm.
But he was not a mentor in the sense that I think people think about mentoring.
Yeah.
I learned more about observation than I did,
Yes.
hanging out
Conversation.
and conversation. Yeah. So, but as Renita said, there are a number of male allies because when we came along, that's about all that had access to pulpits. And so some of them did come alongside me, and I'm sure Renita has the same testimony, and who were very instrumental in
opening
affirming
doors.
our gifts, and opening doors for us. So I think you need somebody that's been where you're trying to go, whether it's male or female.
Yeah, by all means. Mm-hmm.
My dad, who was my pastor when I was young, when I joined the Church of God, was primarily a mentor to me. And my father had an 8th grade education, but literally was one of the most learned people I knew in his era. He dropped out of school to farm, and then he went to the Army. But my father read everything, and across all kind, like he knew history and politics and sports, and of course the Bible. He could recite.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was the kind of person that would pick up, would say, turn the page so and so in the hymn, and start singing it while we were trying to find it, and taught us to sing 4-part harmony while we were taking our ride, down to his mother. So part of it is depending on how, if mentorship means somebody got to be up, you got to be up against somebody, that's not mentoring to me. That can be so codependent. It is learning from people whether you have personal relationship with them or not.
And whether you have personal access to them or
Personal
not.
access. Yes.
Access. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So here's another question. How do you preach through your own pain? I'm just going to say you got to learn that one, because you're going to have to get up to preach one time when you're like laying down. So what would y'all say?
With the help of God. With the help of God.
Well, the pulpit is not your therapy.
Right.
It is not your place to, woe be unto us when we get to that point. We have all sat in the audience and watched a man or female preaching, and you're like, baby, you should have worked that out before you got up here, because see, this is way too much right here, and all of your pain. So we preach through it by that. Well, that's the beauty of, I'm sure directors, I'm sure writers, novelists write through their pain. Directors direct through their pain. You find another story. You find a story that is outside of you that may resonate with what you are going through, but you are not the protagonist of the story. You are not the centerpiece of the sermon. It is David's grieving over the death of his child. It is Hagar being the outside woman. It is, Jesus at the cross. It's not you on the cross. It is Jesus on the cross. Right. So how do we preach through it? We preach through it by finding stories that resonate with perhaps where we are in our lives, and that makes for rich storytelling. But I am not at the center of the story, and I am open for the story to critique me, and for the story to interrogate me. That for the same ways that we read novels and say, oh my God, I identify with Baby Suggs. Oh, I identify with Nell and Sula in the book of Mars and Sula. So that's how we preach through it, by these beautiful characters and these beautiful stories that stand outside of us, but also reflect our lives.
Mm-hmm. And I tell my students all the time when I'm teaching homiletics, if you cry your way through the story, that ain't the story you tell. That's not.
That's a good point.
And I also add that when you have the option, sometimes you need to just sit down.
Yeah.
When you have the option, sometimes, it's a little too painful. And when you have others that can preach for you, you invite Valerie Bridgman, you invite Renita Williams, you invite others to stand in those pulpits, because sometimes we're just not ready. Sometimes I'm just not ready to to
Yeah.
stand and try to proclaim anything to anybody else. Yes,
Yeah.
I agree with Renita, but I also think that there are times that we need to take a break.
I also think sometimes women who refuse to say no to a preaching assignment because they literally act like they never gonna be invited again. That ain't your last time to get an invitation.
Right.
If you're not ready, you're just not ready. And
Right.
that's what I often will say. And I've only had to do this a couple of times in my 40-something years of preaching, which is I just can't do it. But here's the name of somebody.
Right.
And I will lift up the name of another sister or two. You know, I often will text a friend and say, are you able to go? And then I'm gonna give them your name. I don't know that they're gonna call you, but whatever.
Yes.
And so that's another way of mentoring too, is that you offer the names of people that you can.
Yeah.
Okay, question. How do you deal with difficult texts, what Phyllis Trible called texts of terror, that are clearly, you know what they clearly are? Do you preach them or ignore them? You know, how do y'all go for that? So I have an answer, but y'all go.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I do know, but I those kind of questions, they're so open-ended. I'm always not sure where to, as Katie Cannon said, I don't know how to get in that water and start swimming because I don't know where the sharks are. And that was Katie's image for me many times over the years. The late Dr. Katie Cannon. You preach difficult texts, but you learn how to do it. You do your research. You see how others have done it. If you feel like if that is the text that God has called you to, you don't have to preach the whole thing. Sometimes you can just preach a slice of it. Right. And just it is difficult. That is, I think, the beauty of the Bible. That is why it is the beautiful text, and that is the reason for its longevity. I think it is because it tells complicated stories. It tells the painful stories. It tells even the stories that are highly problematic. The terrorizing stories of the concubine, the terrorizing story of women stoned to death. Those are part of the biblical story, and it is part of our task, particularly as women and preachers, I think, is to stand there and to critique these stories. And we're saying we do not just follow the narrative. We read the backside of the narrative. We critique the narrative, and so it takes a certain amount of skill. It does. It takes a certain amount of courage. It does. But you will always find people in the audience who said, thank you. I've always thought that, thank you. And so, I mean, I think, just in terms of if I can give you 3 steps to it, I mean, I just think that's what it takes. It takes a kind of skill set, yes, but it also takes reading, because now every book is out here now about texts of terror, something about problematic, difficult texts that wound us. There's so many books out there now. So we've got the content is out there for you to study. Now you also, lower your expectations of saving the whole world over this text. just do your thing, baby. You ain't got to save the whole world. And I may say this: the need for us to be brilliant, the addiction to cleverness. Everybody wants to be clever in the pulpit, a clever interpretation, a brilliant interpretation. Everybody wants to have that interpretation. Profound, just deep. Everybody wants to become canonical now. Everybody wants to be canonical. This sermon was the canonical one that set the standard. Who was it says, listen, I'm just coming to you with a simple word from the Lord, okay? Right. So you don't have to be deep, you don't have to be clever. I'm so sick and tired of clever preachers, and everybody got an insight that nobody else ever had, and theirs is they want to copyright it. They almost want to copyright their cleverness, and you're like, for real? Have we gotten here to preaching? Yeah. So I think that's also I think what happens, because we all want to get on Facebook and say, that so preach. When I tell you, and that is not helpful. And that really is. I'm really concerned about that kind of slapping on the back. That was some kind, and we have all been, I mean, I appreciate what people said about me, and I've tried to say about others, but we kind of hype preaching in a certain kind of way to make it, it's no longer the word of God, is no longer us wrestling with something. It's now very performative, and you must be outstanding every sermon. And the pressure to be clever and to bring a unique interpretation, I think has harmed us as preachers.
Yeah, I agree. I would say what Renita said, but I would just add, you read, you research, and then I think it's important to have conversation partners too.
Yes.
Really important when you're especially talking about difficult texts.
There are Woman Preach Nation people in the chat. They will agree that that's the place where we actually pick hard texts to give people a place to wrestle with these kinds of practice. So practicing in front of people who ain't gonna kill you, right? Practicing with people or talking it out with somebody who wants you to succeed around this. I don't avoid hard texts, and partly it may be because I'm a scholar, but also because I'm a preacher of 40 years. Most of these texts is telling a real story. We know women who, if they ain't been cut up in 12 pieces, they've been brutalized by somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we don't know them personally, we know people who know somebody for whom that is true. So these stories deserve to be ripped from the headlines, right? And put in conversation with the biblical text that people say they love so much. Well, I'm convinced that part of the problem with the church is that we stick with the Sunday school version of the Bible, where we take out all the difficult texts, all the blood, we take out all the difficult texts, so then we don't actually wrestle with the text, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And when I let my associate ministers preach, I read their sermons before they preach. That's just a part of it. But I would also say that, if you're wrestling with a difficult text, it may not be a bad idea to let someone whose insight you trust, whose scholarship you respect, read that sermon as well, before you preach it.
Right.
What makes a text difficult, I think, part of what makes the text is, for at the basis of it, just the grit, the gore, the of what's going on, the murder of somebody, the unjust murder. Okay, but then also what makes the text difficult, there is the content itself. There's the abominable content itself of murder, of slaughtering children, of rape, and God said go rape and pillage and to tear out. Okay, that's what. But what also makes it a difficult text is that we must now critique the Bible in front of an audience that believes that you don't critique the Bible. You see, so it is difficult first because the content itself is objectionable, it's morally reprehensible to our values now and what we stand for. But then there's also the fact that now I am called to stand before an audience and critique Paul, and critique Moses, and critique the book of Leviticus, and critique, maybe even Jesus telling her woman the dogs get, and so now that's also what makes it difficult and frightening, because we don't know how the people, they may agree with you that the woman
read the text and we said thanks be to God.
Yeah.
and you're like, what?
Yes.
Okay, we're running out of time. I'm trying to get through. Don't nobody else put no more questions in, because we're done. How can men in ministry intentionally serve as allies to their ministerial sisters? This is from a young brother.
Okay, Gina, your pastor was very supportive of you.
Yeah, and basically the first thing he did, he believed in the call on my life, and he believed that when I said that I was called, in fact, he believed it before I even came. He recognized it before I did, but he was willing to do whatever he could to help me, and whatever that meant, whether it meant supporting me, whether it meant mentioning my name to other people, speaking my name into destiny, whether it meant standing up for me
Right.
and not being silent when he was attacked by others who didn't believe in women. I think that was probably one of the things that he gave me the most, was his advocacy.
Yes.
And it wasn't
Yes.
just advocacy when he was with me. He was my advocate in front of brothers who back then challenged him about
Yes.
licensing a woman to preach, and he refused to back down.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was
Yes.
probably the greatest gift that he
Yes. Yes.
and not only the advocacy from his brothers, but I didn't realize how much he protected me even in our own context, because I was the first woman to be licensed to preach. And while everybody seemed to agree, everybody didn't agree. And so there were private battles that he fought that I really didn't realize until after his death.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you have to, it's very interesting because I know some brothers now who fight for women, and then they get suspicion from all sides, women and men. So, but they have to keep doing it.
Right.
They believe in it.
That's right.
Like you have to be willing to take the hit. If
Yeah.
you're an ally and you can back out when it gets hard, you ain't no ally.
Right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
That's exactly
Next question, which is, how do you be sensitive to the local church and also help the local church see the global picture in your preaching? How did you go global in your preaching?
Well, you have to be informed. You have to stay informed. I mean, the text itself is global. The Bible is about people that are foreign people. You know, it is about a part of the world that we don't live in.
Right.
It is about people who we do not know. The text itself is foreign. Let's be clear about that. And it is a story about the migration of peoples. It is a global story. It is about geopolitics. It is about immigration. It is about national and international wars. It is about famine that crosses across regions of the world. It is, it is about wars and rumors of wars between nations. So it should not be. I mean, we have domesticated it.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, we've
That's
domesticated, but it really is about the world.
Right.
It is not about Nashville, Tennessee.
Right. Or Memphis.
Or Memphis.
Right.
Go ahead, Gina.
I mean, I agree with you. I'm just affirming what you say. You know, for God so loved the world.
Right.
Yeah.
And we have shrunk the world, but the Bible
Yes, yes.
is not. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, next question, which is, how do you get into the habit of reading consistently and regularly? Do you set a schedule, specific number of pages a day, whatever? Okay, however y'all want to answer that.
Readers read.
Right.
Right.
You know, readers
Right.
read.
Mhm.
And it is a habit. It is, I don't know how to go to bed without a book nearby.
Right.
I don't
Right.
know how to get on an airplane, that thing we used to do a long time ago. I don't know how to get on a plane without a book. So, and when I don't read, I can tell something inside of me is shrinking. I don't know how to approach a text unless I read something about the text.
Right.
So
Right.
it is, it's not hard.
Right. Yeah. And I would say the same thing. I mean, I go to bed with books. I go to the beauty shop with books. I have books in bags that I forgot I had. I bought 2 or 3 books 3 times because I forgot I had because I don't know where the book
That's
is.
right.
I have books on Kindle. You read.
Yeah.
Readers read, as Renita said. And
Right.
so I'm very eclectic. I'm concrete sequential in terms of my learning style, but in terms of the way I read whenever I get a chance.
Right.
So if it's on a plane, I'm reading. If I'm waiting and getting my hair done, I'm reading. If I'm, at home, and before I got on this call, I was reading. So you do it whenever you have opportunity.
And you build the habit of reading by reading. Like
Right.
literally, that's the answer.
But I think also you follow the recommendations of people who you trust.
Right.
So, I mean, you go through, if it's Facebook of your world, you get on Facebook, and there are certain people, when they say, read this, I'm going to read it. Some other people say,
immediately.
read this New York Times op-ed, when this person says read this New York Times op-ed, I'm going to read it. Now somebody else says I may not read it. I don't read everything that comes up on Facebook. I don't look at the murders. I don't go to everybody's website about, what the mama said about the cousin who did that. I'm not interested in all of that. I don't care. I don't want to know nobody's details of, all of that kind of stuff. I want to see what the major thought leaders of the country are saying about these issues. I'm gonna trust some of that, and I got about 1 or 2 websites I'm gonna trust, and I'm going on to see Jesus. I just can't be doing that. Y'all doing too much.
So there are 3 more questions. Actually, there are supposed to only be 2. I think one of these last people added after Gail's question, so I may not get to this, but
Okay.
and we're past time. So
Okay.
Gina, I know where you have to be at 8 your
Okay.
time. So we're not
Yes.
going that far.
Okay.
So I'm telling you, I'm not answering your question. The last person that put a question in there. It's not
Okay.
happening. It's not
Okay.
happening. So don't try to put any more questions in the Q&A. What are some of the mistakes preachers make? As preachers, not as persons. So here's my first one, missing that exit. Some people don't know the end of a sermon, and they will keep going when the people have left them.
Okay. Gina, you're getting your dissertation, Gina.
Over illustration,
Oh God.
telling too many stories, and not tightening our sermon. I don't know any other way to say it, but structure, a lack of structure, and over illustration. I would say structure is your friend.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That and having too many points.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who was it that said every sermon ought to have one good point? Which one was that?
I know Renita Weems has often said that. I said that because I've used it to say each one of the prophets in the Old Testament had a point, had their theme, and that was all they talked about. Right. Whether it was holiness, the holy God for Ezekiel, whether it was the notion of justice for Jeremiah, whether it, any number, but they all have a particular theme. And I think all of us have our own theme. There are sermons that we come back to. There are theological themes that we come back to all the time. So I think that that to me is very important. Just, do your work.
Yeah.
And do what you have been called to do, and be faithful to yours.
Mm-hmm.
And don't worry about trying to be faithful to anybody else's.
Right.
Gina?
Well, I just gave you the 2 that immediately came to mind was, structure and over illustration. Mm-hmm. I think that those 2 are really important. And, of course, as we talked about earlier, being you. Being who you are authentically are, and not trying to be everybody else. I think sometimes we, they say imitation is the highest form of flattery, and I think we do glean from other people. But I also think it's important for us to do what we do and be who we are. And if that means that I am not, if that means that I'm a closer and a hooper, then I need to be who I am, but be my best self. If that means that I'm a person who basically is a teacher, then I need to be that person as well. And not necessarily try to be a conglomeration of all these different voices that I'm hearing. And then the other thing I would say is, I don't think we should ever substitute style for substance.
Yes.
I think sometimes in our effort, as Renita said, to be clever and to get likes and to, hear the things that people are saying about, ooh, she shut it down and she wrecked the house and all of that. We sometimes miss out. We substitute style for substance. But I believe if we, work on writing a good word and do the work that we need to do, then, God will bring the increase.
Okay, so we don't have time to unpack what you said about writing a good word, because most people don't have structure because I've had so many students say to me, I just want the Spirit to speak. I ain't writing nothing down. So I often say, you mean the Bible that you claim God inspired, the same God that inspired the Bible that was written can't inspire you to write something down? Like literally, you could, even if I don't read from even if I don't read from my manuscript, which I often don't, and I do an outline so I can get it in my head, I at least know where I'm going. Like
Right.
I've thought that through. I put that down so I can know where I'm going. And oftentimes the reason people don't have structure is because they literally haven't thought it through. They have an idea and they haven't thought it through.
Right.
Okay, last question before we close is, can you talk about a disappointing moment you experienced in ministry and how you regrouped to continue moving forward? That's the last question we're taking.
Yeah. There are disappointing moments in ministry. In this life, you will have tribulations and trials. Yes, by all means. I don't know if I can think of, at my age, if I can think of one that was, defining. I would say that there have been disappointing moments in one's career,
Right.
in one's profession, in one's industry. Have there been moments when I have not preached up to my own standard? Yes. Have, as Gina says, have there been moments when we have flunked the test, flunked the assignment, and we have felt, by your own standard, by all means. I have a running joke with my husband, who for many years was the pastor, and I was, whatever I was, a traveling evangelist all over the country. But, and I would give him a critique, and he used to say to me, he said, but you know what the difference between me and you is? We need a, he said, they coming back next Sunday to hear me. He said, I may not have done well this Sunday, but I got a people who going to give me another chance. He said, when you the traveling evangelist, you got to be wonderful every Sunday.
Yeah.
He said, I don't have to be wonderful. I have a covenant relationship with people who have said, Pastor, if you don't do well this Sunday, we still going to be here next Sunday. And we will be here to help you find your voice to that sermon. And I think that was mind blowing to me. And I said, that is the difference between the pastor who has a relationship with people, who's the shepherd of these people, and that they help us find our voice. Yes. And they will be back, all things equal, they'll be back next Sunday for you. I will never forget, Gardner Taylor was in a revival one week, and Gardner Taylor preached us crazy, to use that image. The next night, this is back when the revival was the whole week, y'all. The next night, Gardner Taylor got up and said, I forgot to say. And that man went and preached what he forgot to say, and then took the text, then start preaching his new text. And I said, and it was masterful. When he just told us every preacher sits down and say, I forgot to say.
Yes, God.
And that's where you got to trust God. You got to trust God. Yes. And, but the pastor, but those of you who are pastors who don't have to perform and be wonderful every time, you got next Sunday, you got a relationship with people to get back and to say what you didn't say, find another scripture to say what you didn't say. And it's all right. Preaching is also about relationship. It's not about performance. I've got a history. They'll let you say anything if they believe you love them.
That's right.
They'll let you spank them.
Which is why
get away with it.
Be careful what you say, because they'll let you say anything if they believe.
Here's what we have not said. I mean, I'm sure that the questions are probably there. You cannot ask every question. What we haven't said, does it make any difference that we are women in ministry? Right. Does it make any difference? Are these the same questions that men would have asked if we were on a predominantly male? Will it make any difference 100 years from now, 200 years from now, that there's been this spike of women, this curve of women into ministry here at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century? What will we have brought to ministry, to the pulpit, to the preaching task? Is it just, as Val, as you said, as you heard me say there at your installation, is it just add pink and stir, So we've got our wonderful gowns and robes and our nails and all our pretty shoes and all our hair and all of that, and we've got our little gimmicks now, but will it have made any difference? Could God have just gone on with the men and not have ever called us? Because we have not, as you all know, I say, moved the needle at all in terms of prophetic preaching, in terms of changing the church, in terms of transforming our understanding of gender relationships, of sexuality, politics, whatever. Will it make any difference? I close with this one illustration that just blessed my heart. A young lady interviewed me the other week, and she began to tell me the story about her dissertation. So let me fast forward. And then she said, I realized, I was about to do my dissertation on all these male preachers. And she says, and I realized, and she's like 27, 29, whatever. She said, my pastor was Reverend Bishop Barbara Amos. And she said, and I changed my whole dissertation because I realized I grew up under a woman pastor.
Wow.
So my point is, I said to myself, God, it may be her generation.
Yes.
That this child, I said, wait till that whole generation comes up who will only have known Gina as their pastor.
Wow.
Who will then lead and then say, oh, why there's no woman at this church? All I know is women in ministry.
Yes.
Or why there's no male and female pastors at the church? Renita Weems and Martin is, I don't know. Y'all only have one? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I said, wait till this next generation who only known smart women as the deacon, the head of the deacon board, or of the trustee board, or whatever, you know. So it's just not about preaching, but maybe it will be the next generation who will move us forward and move the needle, because they will say, I don't know nothing but women preachers. I don't know nothing but women and male preachers. I don't know what y'all talking about, because that's not what my pastor showed us.
Right.
And so that is, I think, what we are working toward, getting us out of, putting myself out of business. I am working toward that. I no longer have to be the Renita Weems and the this and the that and all of that stuff that people lay on top of you. That one day someone will say, that was my pastor, or that was my chair of the deacon board, or all I know is and therefore, you know, and now I was on the Isle of Patmos and I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Gina, what?
And the
first one passed away.
And there was no more sea.
Gina, get a laugh. That's a close, Renita. That's a close. So
throw me the mic, Renita, so I can go
close right there.
20 minutes.
Gina, say a last word before I close us out.
Well, you know, your question was, how did we preach past our disappointments? And I would say that two things I did. One, sometimes I preached to myself. I can remember in particular one very disappointing time in my life in terms of pastoring, and I had to preach the same night that I found out some bad news, and didn't really feel like preaching, but ended up preaching to myself, using that story to tell my own story, not necessarily referring to myself, being unduly subjective, but using that story to work through my own disappointment. And then the other thing has been in the safety of people that I trust. You know, there's value in perspective, and having someone to talk through what looks like is the very end of the road. The last thing that can happen turns out to be not the worst thing that happens, turns out not to be the last thing. And one of the things that has helped me with that is having people that I can trust, that I can talk to, who help me work through that disappointment. Because a lot of times we are harder on ourselves than anybody else.
Oh, wow.
So thank you both. If we are out of time, I'm going to ask Janae or Jen to put in the chat the link for our next conversation, and one of you to put our Cash App and our PayPal up so people can give, so that we can bless these women. We believe in the theology of abundance. We always have. We believe that God provides for us. God has provided for us. So we're gonna ask you to give so we can bless the women of God.
Listen. Let me just say, sisters, come on, give to Woman Preach. We give to everything else. Give to Woman Preach. If you value this conversation, you value the work of Woman Preach. You value the work that Dr. Valerie is trying to do. Listen, leave something. Do not close out. Go about your business and then try to post all of our comments on your page and you ain't paid for it. So this is work. This is her work. This is the body of her work. This is her capital. And those of you who are indeed graduates of a Woman Preach, get in there right now and say absolutely. You all can leave that. And listen, I'm Pentecostal. Baby, I see $10, $15, $25. If we leave no $5, you put that $25. If there are how many women?
There's at least $3,000 on this call.
That's say
194 folk times $10.
That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about.
So
Every
the $25 line.
Don't let me call the $25 line.
At least 3,000.
This is good soil. This is good soil. Amen. This is good soil for the sake of the next generation.
That's right.
Don't make us have to take out of our salary to keep this work up when you have been blessed. All y'all who done left a comment, this is the God. God is speaking. Oh God. I'm gonna go down the list and see what I'm gonna see if your name.
I'm gonna let you know who's with the $1,000 line and the $500 line and the $100 line and the $50 line and then the whosoever will line. Ain't that how it goes?
That's right.
Yeah.
We all.
I believe. Why be senior women in ministry? What does it mean to be a senior woman in ministry? Is to lend your capital to help somebody else.
That's right.
So to say at this age, at this point, at 30 and 40 years of ministry, sisters, let's do right. Do right by Woman Preach and leave a substantial offering to encourage the heart of this ministry.
That's right. And sustain it.
And to sustain it by all means. Thank you.
Amen.
Let me say the link. We will post both on our Facebook page and in our other social media, the link for the next conversation, which will have our artist in residence, Jahaza Nabu, and one of our board members, Dr. Leslie Dawn Callahan, and our first executive director, Sharice Tucker, on it. We might have another guest, but I don't know that for sure, so I don't want to call her name, but those three people for sure. And let me tell you, Jahaza Nabu is the one who said in one of her poems, why would God call you and not want to hear your woman self? Spit, shine your womb and set it up on the pulpit. So she's going to read some for us. And and so do join. That's going to be June, somebody help me, 16th. June 16th will be our next conversation. This is a part of our 10th anniversary Sankofa Conversations. And because y'all have been here from the very beginning, Renita and Gina, I just want to say one more time on behalf of Woman Preach Nation, thank you so very much. Thank you all for joining us.
Amen.
Great work.
We are going to post this, but we didn't want to do Facebook Live. We wanted this to be special. We are going to post it eventually to our Facebook page and other places so people can see it. But for tonight, we wanted it to be us.
Good.
A few of our closest
Very good.
friends.
Amen.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
God bless.
Thank you so much. Blessings to
Bye,
you.
Renita. Bye, Valerie.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank y'all for coming. What a joy to have you with us.